Here we have the final product of Chapter 6's version of PodPlay, which is the podcast searching application. We're going to start here in podcast activity where all the main work is done. Obviously, have our regular functions on creating the options menu. We'll scroll down over here. We have for performing the search, calls a couple functions. Big one down here is for actually setting up the view models. And then for adding the backstack listener, has a lambda method that responds to changes in the fragment's backstack during the life cycle of the application. Updating our controls throughout the actual application, showing the details fragment oversight. And then this is actually creating the podcast detail fragment. Either creates the details fragment or uses an existing instance if one already is there. And then we have a general error message that we do use a couple times throughout here. I know particularly one time right up here in on show details. And here's the actual details for the podcast fragment. And this allows us to actually scroll and initialize the recycler view. And the update controls uses the view data that populates the title, the text view elements with the description, and loads the image using glide. Our general utilities for the date, the HTML. We have our view models for the podcast first. And so get podcast actually gathers and assigns the current podcast date. And then podcast to podcast view, it converts a podcast model to an actual object. And then episode to episode view can iterate over the episodes and can convert them into models to episode view data objects and collects everything into a list. Go down here to search view model and we set up a repository that's going to fetch information for the podcast that we're searching through. And we have a function here that converts raw info into actual viewable data. And this function actually searches through the podcast itself. Over here in our services, we have our iTunes service, our podcast response service. Kind of has, the exact number of the podcast there, has the results. What's really important here is the RSS feed response. This here represents all of the data you'll be retrieving from the RSS feed. Goes through here, including the episode responses as well. And then another important one over here is the RSS feed service. And so this actually receives the RSS feed using OKHTTP. And then down here, this actually converts the DOM to RSS so that it's usable. We have our repositories, which go between the database. And if the feed response is null, it'll actually pass null to the callback method. And if it's valid, then it converts it to a podcast object and passes it to the callback method. And this down here, RSS items to episodes, uses the map method to convert a list of episode response objects into a list of actual episode objects. We have our models. This just goes through what you're going to see for each episode and again for each podcast. And then we have our adapters up here. And I have footage of the actual application in action. We have PodPlay right here. Once we get here, we have a search bar. I'm going to search, I believe, the word Barney. And we have Barney Talk up here. You can scroll through. Very nice. I'm going to go back. And click another one. Same functionality. We're going to go back really quickly, and I think we're going to touch this one here. And again, the same functionality. Be able to scroll down. Everything looks good. We got the times, the date that it was uploaded, and full functionality for the PodPlay application.